Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased to have you join us today for the virtual launch of IUCN's new flagship report series, Nature in a Globalized World. And our first report focuses on conflict and conservation. I'm Kristen Walker-Painemia, and I am your host today as we go through this session. Can I please have the agenda pulled up? Thank you. Thank you so much. So our session will be broken into 3 parts today. We'll have some opening remarks, the presentation of the report, and then we hopefully will have some time for some question and answers. Given that we have an hour to start this launch, I would like to pass over the comments for opening remarks to Dr. Bruno Oberle, the IUCN Director General. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and a good day to all of you. Excellencies, members, partners, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to see you here today. I am delighted to welcome our honorable guest, panelists, and participants to the important and timely launch of the IUCN Flagship series, Nature in a Globalized World. The report series will demonstrate how critical conserving nature is for human well-being and all life on Earth. Each report in the series will address a pressing global challenge and explore the significance of nature conservation in the context of that challenge. In addition, each report will also publish country-level data on selected dimensions of nature, such as threats and pressure, conservation action, and economic benefits. The report launched today focuses on armed conflict and nature. It is especially relevant now as armed conflicts continue to stretch many societies to their limits, disrupting lives, displacing people, destroying livelihoods, and causing great environmental damage. We know we must conserve nature and prevent conflict. This is enshrined and formalized in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But while there is a long scholarly and policy history that links war and the environment in general, the specific relationship between armed conflict and nature conservation have seen less attention so far. In this report, IUCN filled in the gaps by examining 3 decades of data on armed conflicts and their potential drivers across all countries of the world. We have synthesized current existing research, conducted targeted data analysis, and assessed policy and practice implication to achieve this. The links between conflict and nature goes both ways, with nature and natural resources playing a role in conflict, and conflict in turn affecting them. We know that armed conflict overwhelmingly impacts nature negatively. For example, this report has revealed that species tend to be threatened in areas that have experienced armed conflict. Using statistical methods to scrutinize the data over 30 years across many countries, some of which have experienced many conflicts and some very few, the assessment helps uncover the magnitude and significance of nature in the context of armed conflict. The results show that countries with scarce availability and low natural resource productivity, especially agricultural lands, tend to be more conflict prone, as are those more dependent on natural resources and at greater risk of drought. An example of this is Lake Chad, bordering 4 countries, and the site of conflict that has claimed more than 30,000 lives since 2009. As such, conserving and in many cases restoring ecosystem to improve their condition and ability to support livelihoods and nature is a crucial opportunity for nation and the international community to deploy. A key question addressed in today's report is whether investment in conservation could contribute to peace and security, by improving people's livelihoods and well-being in conflict zones. While the policy recommendations in this report vary across different sectors, in the longer term, the most important implications come from asking this simple key question: can investment in nature contribute to peace? And I'm very heartened to say that the answer is yes. Today, we can firmly say that conserving and sustainably managing nature and natural resources can improve people's livelihoods and well-being, and therefore provide the building blocks for peace and security. I wish to end by thanking the invaluable funding of the Agence Française de Développement and the Italian Development Cooperation. Their support was crucial to the publication of this work, which we are all proud of. With today's publication, we can now look forward to the next stage, where we promote and implement the report's key messages in conservation and development worldwide. I therefore invite you all to the upcoming IUCN World Conservation Congress in September, which will provide a key opportunity to continue driving momentum forward in this effort. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Bruno, for your opening remarks and setting the stage for this flagship report. I would like to turn to our next set of opening remarks to the Honorable Marina Sereni, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Government of Italy. And we would again like to thank the Government of Italy for their support in these efforts. Vice Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Director General, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Director General for organizing this virtual event and for promoting a discussion on the linkage between conflict and nature. I am pleased to address the IUCN community for the first time. One lesson we are learning the hard way while facing the combined impact of COVID-19 and climate crisis is that we urgently need to rebalance the relationship between humans and nature if we truly want to ensure a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient future for all, and especially for the generations to come. The Italian cooperation has been supporting this view, and we started doing so before the COVID-19 crisis. IUCN has been a partner of the Italian cooperation since 1995. We have worked together in the 5 continents to support developing countries in the conservation, sustainable use, and restoration of nature, in the firm conviction to bring co-benefits on economic growth, inclusiveness, decent employment, well-being, human rights, stability, peace, security, and resilience. In this light, the Italian cooperation is delighted to have supported this inaugural IUCN Flagship report on conflict and conservation. The report reveals that it's possible to turn the vicious circle into a virtuous one. In other words, the vicious connection between violent conflict and environmental degradation can only be faced through environmental peace building. Indeed, IUCN's practical recommendations represent a valuable contribution to the mainstreaming of environmental considerations in different policy domains. The correlation between armed conflict and the environment has often been neglected despite the adoption of the 2030 Agenda. Hostilities produce strong negative impacts on nature. With an innovative approach, the report seeks to answer the key issue of the contribution of investments in biodiversity conservation on peace building and on the improvement of social well-being. We consider this evidence-based analysis as necessary and crucial today in order to shed new light on the positive role of the protection of natural capital in preventing conflicts and, more in general, address social challenges. By making the planet one of the pillars of its strategy, the Italian cooperation has integrated the vision that there is no sustainable development and long-lasting peace if natural resources are not safeguarded and managed responsibly. Many of the policy options set out in the report are already implemented in the Italian development initiatives. I am referring to improving the inclusiveness of the governance of natural resources, recognizing legitimate eternal rights, including rights of vulnerable populations such as indigenous people, mainstreaming gender equality and women's empowerment, and promoting sustainable agriculture. The effective conservation and restoration of ecosystems, together with an equitable management of natural resources, can help indeed preventing and mitigating conflicts. Today, this conviction is reinforced by the valuable contribution of this report that I am sure will inspire and motivate further implementation of good practices. In conclusion, allow me to take this opportunity to mention that as G20 presidency, Italy is working to focus the agenda of the environment track also on biodiversity, nature protection, and ecosystem restoration, including the potential of nature-based solutions for aligning climate change and biodiversity strategies and programs. I look forward to the development of future volumes in the Nature and in a Globalized World series. You can surely count on the Italian cooperation in the global endeavor for people, planet, and prosperity. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Vice Minister. So I think we have the stage set for the framework for the report looking at nature and conservation, the issues of armed conflict, but I think the Vice Minister highlighted a very important aspect of sort of how we need to rebalance our relationship between humans and nature, and how natural resources are critical to environmental peace building, and the investment in natural resource management is extremely important in looking at preventing conflict. I now want to turn our opening remarks to His Excellency Amin Malik Aslam, Federal Minister and Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on Climate Change, and a member of the IUCN Council. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine, and good day to Bruno and Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum and a good day. I would like to start off by thanking IUCN and the governments of France and Italy for this really seminal work on nature. And I think it comes at a very opportune time, because this is the year that nature has really made a comeback, because in the COVID era, what we've learned is two very important lessons. The first one is that nature works with thresholds, and our relationship with nature is based on a certain balance, and we need to respect that balance. And we've seen that when we cross the threshold, what happens, and that nature reacts. And the zoonotic disease that we are all engulfed in at the moment is really a manifestation of that imbalance. Secondly, there is also a positive message coming out of this COVID era that also has to do with nature and our relationship with it. And that message is that we can come out of this crisis on a better pathway, a green pathway, and what we call a build back better pathway. And I think that is where the hope lies. So I think in this backdrop, this report really comes out at a very timely, as I said, initiative, and it gives a very strong message. This series of report, which is going to look at nature in a globalized world, and the first report, which is really looking at nature and conflicts, is really something which has not been done before. And as our colleague from Italy just mentioned, that this is a science-based, evidence-based report, which looks at this two-way relationship between nature and conflict. So we see this vicious circle between the degradation of environment and conflict, with one feeding into the other. So with more environmental degradation, we see more conflicts happening. And with more conflicts happening, we see more environmental degradation. So it's a never-ending cycle. And this report really points out that to break away from this vicious cycle, we need to invest in nature, and we need to invest in peace-building measures based on nature conservation. And it gives the example of water diplomacy, peace parks, and other such measures that can be taken to get out of this, self-defeating equation, which is also harming nature and at the same time also leading to more conflict. So this is a very timely reminder to us that there are policy options available which can get us out of this vicious cycle and build a positive relationship with nature, to rebalance our equation with nature. So I think that it is not only going to help us in getting onto this green based recovery, but it is also going to feed into the global debate which is happening on a number of issues related to nature and conflict zones. I know that the definition of eco-terrorism, the environmental war crimes debate, all of this is going to be something which is going to really benefit from this informed, science-based report which is going to go out. So I would like to, in the end, again, congratulate IUCN for this very timely report. And like Bruno said at the start, the important one-liner message coming out of this report is that if we invest in nature, we are really investing in global peace. And that is the main takeaway of this report. And I'm glad that we have this takeaway coming out of this report. So I think that this is going to help countries as they build back better onto a green pathway and really provide us a blueprint for the green recovery that the world is looking for. So again, congratulations and a very timely report, and we all look forward to the rest of the reports coming out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And I think very important points that you made in talking about this cycle of degradation of nature and the increased amount of conflict, and how IUCN's report will really contribute to the global debate. And that we need to use mechanisms such as water diplomacy, peace parks, but really looking at investing in nature is really looking at investing in global peace. With that said, I want to transition to the next part of our segment. And I want to remind participants that we are using the Q&A function to prepare for our third segment. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A segment. But I want to turn to Dr. Juha Sukamaki, Chief Economist at IUCN, and he is the curator of the report. So he's going to take us a little bit a dive into the report so we can get the key messages. And then you will all be able to access the report online. So again, please remember to, as you're listening or as you're reflecting on the opening remarks, drop in questions into the Q&A, and we will get to them after we hear about the key messages from the report. Juha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristen. Your Excellencies, honorable guests, dear participants. It's excellent to see so many people joining us today from all over the world. As noted by Dr. Oberle, IUCN Director General, with today's event, IUCN is launching a flagship report series titled Nature in a Globalized World. The purpose of this report is to mainstream conservation. And to do so, we demonstrate the importance of conserving nature for human well-being and all life on Earth. And to do so, each report in the series will address a pressing global challenge and explore the significance of nature within that particular context. Each report, besides focusing on this unique thematic assessment, we call it part 1, the report will also include part 2 that publishes country-level data on selected dimensions of nature, including its status, related threats and pressures, conservation actions, and economic benefits from conservation. This first report focuses on armed conflict and conservation, with the purpose of filling in the gaps in the academic and policy attention to the interlinkages between war and environment in general. In this space, specific relationships between armed conflict and nature conservation have received relatively little attention. The report is a product of a big group effort. It was co-written by 27 specialists from experts from IUCN commissions, members of the IUCN Secretariat, and beyond. It was also peer-reviewed by 8 independent specialists. We thank governments of France and Italy very much for supporting their work. The theme of armed conflict and nature is particularly timely as armed conflicts cause great economic and social harm, also environmental damage around the world. Unfortunately, policies to better manage and moderate pressures that drive armed conflicts, have been unable to prevent their number from continually increasing and now reaching what is their highest level for 30 years. Fatalities from armed conflict are distributed globally, but they're concentrated in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa and West and South Asia. In aggregate, conflicts are responsible for more than 2 million deaths since 1989. Interlinkages between conflict and nature conservation, they occur across different stages of conflict, from the very beginning to the end. These encompass also the preparation and post-war stages. One detrimental consequence of armed conflict involves forced displacement. This has affected more than 70 million people globally, with many of them currently still being affected. This report focuses on living nature, that is biodiversity. This encompasses a continuum from genetic diversity through species to entire ecosystems, and considering also renewable natural resources as a separate element of nature. The linkages between conflict and nature and natural resources, they're not unidirectional, but they go both ways. Conflict affects nature and natural resources in turn affects conflict. In this report, we assess these effects in both ways, from conflict to nature and from nature to conflict. The complexity of these relationships requires a use of a range of approaches. Here we consider synthesis of current literature, exploratory quantitative analysis of primary data. We also include a number of case studies to better highlight the specific conditions in a particular location. In particular, regarding this context, the report assesses different natural resources, geographic regions, and different environmental, institutional, socioeconomic, and political circumstances. All essential considerations when we think about armed conflict arising and options for searching for peace. The empirical parts of the assessment draw primarily from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. This is the world's primary provider of data on armed conflict. The Uppsala program combines event-level data on armed conflicts, including their date, location, and number of fatalities. Figure 1 here maps the geographic distribution of armed conflict events in the database over the last 3 decades or so. Now with that, a quick overview of the purpose, scope, and approaches used in this report. Let me briefly highlight the key results from the assessment. When assessing the impacts of armed conflict on nature, the report finds them overwhelmingly negative, although they vary in detail. These negative impacts can include killing of animals for food or trade. They can involve degradation of ecosystems, both as a tactic of war, but also as a consequence of it. It can also involve reduction in conservation capacity, and also prosecution of environmental defenders, which is unfortunately becoming more and more common today. There are some mainly historical evidence that war may have positive impacts on nature, but we find that those such impacts appear to be temporary and soon overwhelmed by developments that follow armed conflict. We examined the IUCN Red List of Species data. This is the world's most comprehensive inventory of global conservation status of species. We examined these data along with data on armed conflict. These analyses reveal that species in general and threatened species in particular are more likely than expected to occur in areas that have experienced armed conflict. By contrast, key biodiversity areas and protected areas also, they tend to contain less conflict than expected. In other words, the report finds that the conflict conservation relationships may be very scale dependent. There are positive associations at broad geographic scales, but negative ones at finer scales. The report explores these issues at more detail. Excuse me. When examining the effects of nature and natural resources on conflict, the report finds that degradation of nature is strongly, even though variably, but strongly associated with increased risk of conflict. This is the case across multiple components of living nature. First, at the species level, there's some evidence that unsustainable exploitation of wildlife and timber are acting as drivers of conflict by financing conflict. At the ecosystem levels, both land degradation and deterioration of land in general, but also aquatic ecosystems, can also increase the risk of armed conflict. There is a prominent, although somewhat contested branch of literature that also points to climate change as a driver of conflict. In the end, all these different factors will coexist as drivers of conflict or drivers of options for peace. In sum, by analyzing this armed conflict data from across the world for over the last 30 years or so, the report finds that countries that tend to be more conflict prone when natural resources, especially agricultural lands, are less available. So there's less area on a per hectare or acre basis of agricultural lands, or when they're less productive, meaning that the condition, the productivity of lands has been reduced by degradation. These are countries that tend to be more conflict prone. Whereas countries that are more dependent, and as well, the countries that are more dependent on natural resources and where drought is prevalent, they're also more conflict prone. These come from a broad scale assessment at the global level, examining the different drivers. We recognize that in specific conditions, the relationships may turn out slightly different. Now, these relationships uncovered in this report shed light on a suite of potential policy options. Those policy options are available to simultaneously conserve nature and promote peace. In the report, we discuss and explore these options not only based on the literature, but especially by drawing from the broad experience of IUCN experts that have gained first-hand experience on these options by putting them into practice around the world. Many of the recommendations revolve around strengthening natural resource governance. This can include inclusive decision-making, stabilizing land tenure and resource rights. It can involve improving accountability and transparency. Recognizing the rights of indigenous people and women is essential, and as well as advancing coordination within countries, just to name a few examples. Improved natural resource management is also important. This can involve protected area establishment and management. It can involve sustainable land and water use, adherence to standards and safeguards for environmental and local sustainability. And finally, also the greening of military and humanitarian operations can play a considerable role here. Now, finally, mechanisms for environmental peace building between countries, they encompass both legal instruments and transboundary management arrangements. In terms of legal instruments, international agreements and enforcement of obligations in international courts are central. In transboundary management arrangements, there's an option of hydro-diplomacy to promote peace, management of shared marine resources, and establishment of park for peace are also noted as key options in this context. Now, what are the key implications of these findings? They vary, and they apply differently to different sectors and different locations. But overall, we find that the relationship, we find a key message that investing in conservation and restoration of nature and natural resources can help prevent conflict. It can help build peace. So even in the times of the pandemic, and perhaps especially when looking for options to build back better, this message can help countries and the world move towards a more peaceful and sustainable world. Within this context, several high-level themes emerge for conservation and natural resource governance, international agreements, and humanitarian and military interventions. For natural resource governance, conservation and management agencies, our key message is to continue conservation and to do so even in war-torn regions, while also recognizing that conservation and restoration can contribute in a proactive way to mitigating and preempting armed conflict from emerging. For international agreements and law, we know that protections are needed. They're needed for conservations and protected areas staff. They're needed for environmental defenders. Also, sanctions are needed against those who commit environmental war crimes. For humanitarian and development agencies, the report finds supports environmental peace building through strengthening equitable and transparent governance. And they're already substantial role in this space, but they can expand to support environmental peace building as a further option. Finally, for military options, one key message is that countries need to ensure that military investments actively mitigates harm to nature during and subsequent to conflict. Finally, as I mentioned, part two of this report presents data on a set of indicators to assess national performance in environmental sustainability. While many such indicators are available, this report focuses on one core indicator from each of the 4 components of the widely used state pressure response benefits framework. We pay particular attention to indicators that are based on global IUCN standards when constructing these indicators. As an indicator of the state of the living nature, this report uses the Red List Index by the Red List partnership that IUCN is part of. The Red List Index denotes aggregate extinction risk of species across different taxonomic groups, comprehensively and repeatedly assessed. As the core indicator of pressure facing living nature, this report documents the impact of imported goods for consumption in one part of the world, measuring their impact on species extinction risk elsewhere in the world. These impacts are derived by linking detailed data on trade across commodities, by using all pairwise combinations of countries and different sectors, and connecting them to the IUCN Red List. As an indicator of the response used to safeguard living nature, IUCN works with the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership and the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Center to maintain an indicator of coverage of key biodiversity areas by protected areas. And finally, as an indicator of benefits provided by living nature to people, this report documents the percentage of the total capital in the economy associated with living nature within a country. This assessment uses World Bank assessments and considers forests, including both wood and non-wood health, wealth, croplands, pastures, and protected areas as key components to natural capital wealth. Data generated for these indicators provide benchmarks for countries' environmental performance, environmental sustainability. We develop those benchmarks now, and in future reports, IUCN will monitor and contrast how countries perform according to these criteria that are critical to the sustainability of nature and natural resources. This concludes my presentation, and I'll note in the end that the presentation has only touched the key themes and findings of the report. Please see the report for further information and insights. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Juha, for that overview of the report. I would now like to transition to a little bit of a deeper dive and Q&A from our participants and viewers. And I'd like to welcome Chief Scientist of IUCN, Tom Brooks, as well, to join in the question and answer session as well. May I welcome Tom Brooks to the floor. So we have got a growing number of questions from a very active participation here, and maybe I'll kick it off with, first of all, what do we mean by countries which are more reliant on natural resources? Since all countries survive on and through natural resources, nature and natural resources. Can I also ask that we spotlight Juha in this, since this is a Q&A, and I'd like both of them to have an interactive session as well. Thank you. Tom or Juha, would you like to jump in? Maybe Tom wants to jump in since he's just joining, and we'll put him on the spotlight.
Sure. Yeah. Short answer to that. Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for a fantastic session so far. Definition of reliance on natural resources. This is an economic statistic derived from World Bank data, reflecting the proportion of a national economy that is dependent on primary natural resource activities. I may pass to Juha for any expansions on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So that's spot on. And in addition to looking at this proportion of natural capital wealth that comes from nature, the report measures dependency on nature by countries by measuring several variables. For example, the percentage of rural employment, of all employment in the country, is an indicator of dependency of the economy on nature. We also measure the amount of agricultural lands, forests, and freshwater resources on a per capita basis as a measure of how dependent or how wealthy the country is in terms of natural resource availability. So there's a number of measures that are relevant in this context. And I'll just mention that in the empirical assessments, then the strategy for us is to use multiple measures and see what are the measures that stand strongest in the end based on that analysis. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine a few questions that are here, but first of all, we mentioned and Bruno overlaid this, and Minister Sereni, as well as His Excellency Malik Amin, highlighted the importance and the enormity of the issue, right? We're looking at a post-recovery world. We're looking at the relationship between people and nature. But what does it really mean for conservation or the conservation community, whether it be through local communities, organizations, or governments, to really incorporate environmental peace building into their work? We've highlighted some things that are work that members of IUCN typically do around natural resource governance, about supporting communities. But then this report takes a much deeper dive into looking at reinforcing international law. How do we promote peace at a much larger scale? And what are the standards really for measuring conflict? Will there be standards? Will IUCN push this agenda? So it's a very big question, but it's a very big report. So I pass it back to you both.
Maybe I'll respond to this and first, and then turn over to Tom. It's a key question. What is it that countries can do, and how they can go about addressing drivers that affect a conflict in a particular location? When considering this in a broad way, we find that one key finding is that this issue is relevant across many actors. It's not relevant only for conservation community. It's not relevant for only security community, humanitarian development agencies, security, international law and law community and policy community. We find that it has broad relevance across all actors that have linkages to nature and conservation, even though at the outset those linkages may not seem obvious. So that's a key issue that we view conservation of nature as an overarching, cross-cutting theme that we all should be paying attention to. The same way climate change, climate policy is now clearly agreed upon as a cross-cutting issue. We find that conservation of nature is no different. Regardless of the kinds of sector we're talking about, one needs to consider nature within that context. And so that's a key message. The actions vary very much depending on where you are, whether there's a conflict currently in place, whether it's a post-conflict building process underway, or whether the pressures are moving the society towards conflict. We discussed those quite a lot in the report. And in terms of the standards and what IUCN can do this, perhaps I'll turn over to Tom to address that question. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. So, and a really good question, or actually a couple of questions there coming in the chat about standards for defining conflicts. And as Kristen, as you said, does IUCN need to play a role in supporting such standards and implementing them? I think so obviously IUCN has a an important role in setting and implementing standards. That's highlighted in some of the questions in the chat as relates to standards like the red list of threatened species, the red list categories and criteria. And indeed, the data that emerge from application of those standards are, as Juha explained, are fundamental in underlying many of the analyses presented in the report. But I would actually argue that that IUCN doesn't need to step in a standard setting or implementing role for measuring conflict, because there are excellent existing specialized agencies that are already serving that role. So for the specific case of measuring conflict, the Uppsala conflict data program, as Juha mentioned, has been operating many years, defining a conflict event as, let me pull up the quote here, an incident where armed force was used by an organized actor against another organized actor or against civilians, resulting in at least one direct death at a specific location and on a specific date. And so a conflict can then be made up of multiple conflict events. And so in my view, it's IUCN's role to draw from those kinds of existing standards from specialized programs working on conflict per se, and then IUCN can put that information into the context of nature conservation, examining the implications of both directions, as in this report. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. So maybe I'll jump to, I'll jump to another question that came through. So, you know, when we talk about environmental degradation, it's often an outcome of environmental development, which can take off dramatically as a dividend of peace. Is there a risk that the green recovery pathways would increase the cost and therefore slow down recovery? How would you convince governments to take such a pathway in the face of these urgent short-term needs? That's
an essential question that we need to ask, and countries themselves need to ask. At the outset, the economy has been suffering greatly as a result of the pandemic, in addition to the vast and tragic health costs associated with this. So in many countries, especially those that are rich and quite dependent on natural resources, the situation would make it attractive to leverage the natural resource base as a way to implement recovery. And this is a very intuitive and understandable approach. What our findings suggest, and what I think IUCN's working more generally suggests, that we ought to be thinking about nature-based recovery, recovering economies while investing in nature, and also while not degrading nature. And so one of the key messages here in terms of the pandemic is that first of all, we recognize that there's a need for considering nature, but there's a need for considering nature in the recovery, so that we're not, as part of the quick recovery, we don't put countries on path of further conflict. And I think this report aims to bring that aspect also to the attention of the recovery plans. Thank you. Tom, anything to add from your side?
Just to really highlight the importance of timescales there, the importance of not taking cheaper shortcuts that undermine sustainability and peace in the longer term.
Thank you both. So I'm going to switch gears slightly a little bit. A question has come in and a little bit of chat around this question, really asking, can IUCN and the military or defense agencies and research institutes in a combined manner work toward conserving biodiversity in a border area of conflict in a country or an area that has an extreme amount of conflict? What are your thoughts on sort of looking at that type of partnership or movement to be able to work on these issues?
So can these different constituents work together? Clearly, they can work together, and I would be even stronger than that. They not only can, but they must work together. This issue is cross-cutting, again, from conservation and management of natural resources to humanitarian development efforts to military security activities. So again, it's a theme that is very diffusive. It cuts across all these themes. And the only way to address that effectively, most effectively, is to have partnerships where these different actors work together.
Great. And then I want to go a little bit further. In your key messages and synthesis of the report, you focused a lot on Africa, and that roughly about 2 million fatalities in Africa due to armed conflict. And really, what are some of the issues that have come up with respect to Africa on how this impact has happened, and what is the course that some of the African governments need to take in terms of their environmental agenda, but also overlaying these issues? And if you could give a few examples of countries based on the research that you have done.
Maybe I'll take a try here and then turn to Tom. Well, I do think Africa is a key focus, but when you look at the numbers, but the assessment indeed is global, and the centers of conflict, today are in several regions. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So first of all, I would like to note that this is an issue that is geographically very broadly relevant. Also, the centers of attention, they vary over time. Sometimes those centers have commonalities with historical centers of conflict. Sometimes there are differences, and so all this needs to be considered, especially in Africa and maybe in very resource dependent economies. Degradation of nature is a key issue. Many societies are highly dependent on natural resources. Many countries still have 60, 70, even 80% of employment in rural areas. And when degradation of nature happens, in part because of those pressures that come from the need to draw from natural resources for livelihoods, for food, for income security, the degradation tends to take place, and then that can drive conflict. And in Africa, of course, and all around the world, some of these issues have a kind of a political perspective. Transboundary resource management issues become really essential. And in terms of what can countries do, there's a great deal of detail explored in the report on the policy options that are available in this context. And again, not based only on the literature, but very much drawing from the expertise from the conservation community in terms of evaluating what options are in different locations and what are the most effective options. So I will probably not try to summarize them in any detail because the time does not allow for me to do that. But I would point out that there are options. It's difficult to imagine a country that is completely out of options. So the options are there. Oftentimes they relate to governance issues. They relate to the management of natural resources. They may relate to even international or domestic law. And then the transboundary aspect is essential. Some of the key areas that have been extremely relevant in this context include Lake Chad in Africa. There, the area is extremely one of the most fragile areas in the world, and has lots of security challenges. Has many challenges related to the natural resources. It's also one example where it's difficult to pinpoint any of these factors as a single driver. And so one thing one message that we bring from this report that applies to Lake Chad, applies to Syria, applies to Sahel and elsewhere, is that there are typically maybe no silver bullets. If there were silver bullets, we probably would have discovered them already. Rather, one needs to take a comprehensive approach and understand the complexities of the nature, the society, the political situation in the location, and more broadly, and in a more comprehensive way, then move towards addressing those drivers of conflict, so that then it can mitigate the conflict. We can also maybe move towards a peace building there. So again, and the key finding that we make here is that the conservation of nature needs to be considered within the portfolio of options considered in those contexts. Thank you.
Thank you. I also maybe want to frame this as well. You know, what is the impact on marine, looking at the issues of marine conflict and the impacts on marine species? We tend not to focus on that as much in the broader discussions, but it'd be great to hear from you all with that lens around conflict in marine areas and what has done to species, but also to communities in that sense.
Tom, would you like to address that, and then I'll make a couple of points.
Sure. We don't actually have an enormous amount of evidence on that question. Firstly, because of course both most conflicts themselves and most studies of conflicts have taken place on land. Humanity are terrestrial animals. Also, we know less about nature in the marine environment, and therefore less about the impacts of conflicts on nature. We maybe do have a bit more of an understanding. I think there are some points in the chat on this, on the flows the other direction, on the potential for access to and in particular of unsustainable use of natural resources, an example of maybe unsustainable fisheries in actually driving resource conflicts at sea. But I think it's probably fair to say that interlinkages between environment and conflict in the marine context are an area that's an important research priority.
May I just second what Tom just noted? Not a lot of evidence here to draw from, but quite a few cases though where these issues are highly relevant. Sustainable and unsustainable fisheries practices is a critical problem in general for sustainability. It can be a critical problem for security. Two dimensions there that I wanted to highlight. One is the local versus national versus international dimension. There's a clear conflict sometimes between the interests of say international fisheries industry and local and national industries. And in that case, the fact that we still treat much of the ocean as an open access area, that there's a clear need for managing that more effectively. And then the second more particular to IUCN is that there's been some work also on issues related to conflict and violence, and especially gender-based violence in the context of fisheries. So I'll just highlight that as a topic that has been addressed in an IUCN report last year, and explore some of these issues in more detail.
Great, and thank you. So I'm gonna, given that I am the chair of the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economics, and Social Policy, I can't not go without talking about, you know, this report is focused on sort of continue to support to conservation efforts, but what does this really mean for stakeholders? You know, in the report and in your comments, you highlighted the impact this has had on local communities. It has on our conservation organizations, the issues around park rangers. Many conflicts happen around parks and protected areas where you have invasions of those issues, but you also have tensions. And at the end of the day, it is the people who are impacted physically, mentally, and in conjunction with their relationship with nature. So in a very pragmatic way, as an IUCN constituency in a union, what tools or what elements do we need to think about more succinctly in the work that we do on the ground? And how do we prepare our people who are working on these issues and support them to address and engage, because they are. Many constituents are engaging in areas of conflict as they work in the protection of nature. So I've left you with another big question to wrap this up, but I think this is just the beginning of another conversation. So Juha and Tom.
Tom, would you like to take the first crack, and then I'll jump in?
Sure. Maybe just a couple of points to highlight from my side here. There are some innovations in conservation training and practice that I think are important to bring to the table. One that we highlight in the report is importance of conflict resolution training for environmental defenders, for conservation practitioners on the ground. I also wanted to highlight the fact that while I think it's fair to say that and as was mentioned in some of the opening comments, the interactions between conflict and biodiversity conservation specifically have maybe been less explored, less addressed than some other aspects of environment and conflict interactions in general. That a number of mechanisms of IUCN have actually been looking at these questions for many years, and in that context, I think that IUCN does have some key elements to bring to the table. One very important one relates to environmental law, and the World Commission on Environmental Law has a long history of supporting engagement as relates to the conservation and conflict linkage. A second is through protected areas. There's already been some discussion of the importance of protected areas in helping to break out of the vicious circle of environmental degradation and conflict. And the World Commission on Protected Areas has for many years been supporting the concept of parks for peace. And then Kristen, your own Commission on Environmental, Economic and Social Policy also has a specialist group on conservation and peace. So a number of different elements that the IUCN program brings to the table here. Juha, back to you for the last word.
Just very quickly, that's an extremely good answer, Tom. Thank you for that. I'll just close that by saying that there are a number of actors in the space, members that are already active. The one message that we get here, make here, is that the issue is of broader relevance. It needs to be recognized as an issue. Then there may be a training component involved, an implementation component involved, and then there's critically a learning and improving component in place. And why this is important? Well, we know that conflicts can be extremely disruptive. Once they erupt, they cause irreparable damage oftentimes, and it's very hard to go back. So being proactive in this space, preventing conflict from emerging in the first place by, for instance, improving natural resource productivity, natural resource condition, can be a key element in improving the lives of communities and people around the world, so that then those drivers of conflict are mitigated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juha. And I think, as noted, we have a number of questions we didn't get to. I think Juha and Tom will work on responding to them and posting them online. And I think I would like to invite you on behalf of the other commissions to do another session as we continue to roll out this report, because it'll obviously generate more and more conversations at various levels. But I first would like to pass this over to Bruno Oberle to give his closing remarks. And I want to thank you all for your participation. Bruno, the last words are yours.
Thank you very much, Kristen. It's a really inspiring and interesting conversation. So let me make my conclusion. The first one, it is how important it is to ground politics and policy making on fact, on data. And this is one of the central mission of IUCN, to explore the data and to create a sound basis to take good decisions and to prepare political discussion and decision. And because we have more and more data, more and more monitoring around, we will be able in the future increasingly able to offer this type of support to political debate, as it was pointed to in the chat with regard to monitoring data from satellite. The second element, it is nature is central part of livelihood, of quality of life and security. So if you destroy nature, you impact livelihood and you create a macro risk at the country level. You undermine stability of your country. And the other side, if you invest in nature, you contribute to peace, to livelihood, and you stabilize the country. In a way, it is invest in nature, get peace as a dividend of that investment. The third element, it is the impact on nature. It is not only coming from local forces. It is through value chain, for example. It is coming from consumer in other countries and in other continents. And at the same time, the consequence of the originated conflicts are also, let's say, spreading around through impact chain, for example, through migration from country to country, from continent to continent. And this means that even if the local political authority have the primary responsibility, in a way to support nature to prevent conflict is a shared global responsibility. And it is a reason to take global action. So this is an item that should flow into the global debates, both in the conflict prevention and in the conservation debate, for example, in the CBD COP to come. And the last one, it is our role as IUCN, what we can do, being a membership organization with 1,400 members, almost 100 countries, a lot of subnational public entity, and hundreds of small and big organizations representing civil society. We can engage them in this debate, asking them to hold their government and their partners to account, to deliver towards this nature conservation for peace. And this is in a way also an answer to one question that in the chat that was not addressed so far. It is how can we engage with non-statal actor? It is creating a global debate around this topic of utmost importance. And of course, the next step, the most important next step, there will be a lot of steps, but one of the most important will be the discussion around this topic at our Congress in September, from the 3rd to the 11th in Marseille, France. So there will be the World Conservation Congress where this topic will be discussed again. So please mark this appointment in your agenda, and thank you for engaging here, there, and everywhere on this important topic. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone, and we appreciate your participation today. I remind you that the link to the report is in the chat. If not, you can visit the IUCN website. And please stay tuned as we continue to roll out further discussions on the report, and through social media. IUCN, as Bruno has highlighted, would like to engage on these issues and help to move it forward. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day or evening.